She told me to pack my things as if I were a guest who had overstayed. That sentence landed like a stone in the quiet room that used to be mine. I thought I understood the shape of my life, a small house full of books, the soft echo of Daniel's laughter when he was a child, the steady presence of a husband who called me home. I did not expect the sudden, clinical sentence that stripped me of belonging. I still don't know exactly when warmth turned to chill, only that one afternoon the house hummed differently, and I realized a stranger's voice was louder in my son's home than mine. How does a woman who taught children how to read become unreadable to her own child? How does a son stand aside when his mother is told to leave? I do not begin this story with rage. I begin it with a small suitcase, a key in my palm, and a choice I never thought I'd have to make. Hi, I'm Linda Carrow, and this is my story. Priya shut the bedroom door behind her and folded the clean sheets like an announcement. She did not sit. She did not ask. She told me, plainly, that her parents were moving in and I was to give up the master bedroom. Daniel stood behind her shirtless as if this were an awkward domestic chore and not a life being rearranged. I had come home from a day at the library repair group with a bag of puzzle books. I left with a single suitcase and a paper cup of tea that went cold in my hands. The humiliation was not loud. There's a special kind of humiliation in being treated as a thing to be moved. For 28 years the house had been ours. My husband's grin in the doorway, Daniel's scraped knees, my late husband's rocking chair. Priya's neat voice called out instructions as if she owned the air. I tried to make a small joke, my old instinct to calm, but Daniel did not laugh. The neighbor, Mrs. Olson, watched from her car and did not look surprised. As I put the key into my pocket, my palms trembled with a question I would not yet allow myself to speak. Had they planned this, or was I finally blind to how they thought of me? Cliffhanger. As I closed the door behind me, I heard the soft thud of drawers being emptied. My late husband's things were already being moved. From the curb, with my suitcase at my feet, I watched strangers carry my life into rooms that used to hold memories. Priya's parents laughed in the kitchen, the kind of easy laugh that stakes a claim. The dresser that had held my husband's shirts, the one Daniel used to hide under as a child during thunderstorms, was wrapped in brown paper and guided into a new corner by strangers. I felt the air inside the house slip away like heat through an open window. I called Daniel and the call dropped. When it came back, he said, "We'll talk later," and the later never felt promised. I walked the neighborhood and let the cool bench at the park hold me. A woman I had waved to for years, the owner of the bakery, pressed warm bread into my lap and said, softly, "We saw." I learned, in small slices, how a life can be unstitched, a photo taken from the wall, a lamp unplugged, a favorite mug placed on the moving van as if it belonged to someone else. The pain was not dramatic, it was mundane and therefore worse. That night, under a blanket in a room that smelled like someone else's lavender, I repeated my husband's old line, "This house is always yours," and felt it as a vow I had to test. Cliffhanger. Before I slept, Mrs. Olson tapped my window with her cane and handed me something folded in paper. Mrs. Olson sat across from me on my narrow bed and produced her phone, fingers still sticky from the jam she'd been spreading earlier. She had a recording, an ordinary, terrible thing, Priya's voice, clear and small, saying, "We'll get the deed one way or another." The hearing of it felt worse than seeing movers. Words can shape intent. I listened in the thin lamplight, and every sentence pricked like a needle. Mrs. Olson had put her life on hold that day to listen through an open window, because, she said, she could not bear to see me displaced without the truth. Her kindness felt like armor. I kept the voice note and put it into a folder with a trembling hand. The neighbor's small acts, bringing me stew, a flashlight when my electricity flickered, listening while I cried, became a map of allies I hadn't realized I had. At the same time, Daniel's silence landed heavier. He arrived one evening with a forced smile, set a cup of coffee at my elbow, and said, "It's temporary, Mum. We'll sort this." Sort this? The phrase sounded tinny. He sounded tired in a way that could have been guilt or convenience. I had been a librarian. I have always loved proofs, footnotes, receipts. The voice note became the first breadcrumb. Cliffhanger. The next morning, a letter arrived, unmarked, and inside was a slip of paper with a lawyer's name and number. When you have been a woman of books, you learn the comfort of facts. I sat at a cheap desk in the room I'd rented and opened old drawers in my head to see what evidence lay in them. My marriage certificate, the deed, clear, stamped, my husband's name and mine. I made a pile of the receipts I'd kept for decades, property tax, repairs, the small payments I'd made with a stubborn, private pride. The lawyer from the slip, Mr. Keene, answered my call with the careful gravity of someone who had seen the erosion of families before. You own the house, Ms. Carrow, unless there's a paper you've signed giving it away. He did not say it with triumph, he said it with the coolness of someone placing a tool into my hand. It was the simplest thing and the most powerful. I had the legal authority. Relief was threaded with a slow, simmering anger. How had I missed the way Priya smiled at me with the flatness of someone calculating? How had Daniel allowed this? The clarity did not bring joy, it brought options. If the law recognized me, perhaps I could take a step that would return what had been taken, my sense of boundary. Cliffhanger, Mr. Keene said 3 words that made me breathe differently: you can sell. I called Daniel to ask if this had been discussed between him and Priya. He answered in a voice that wanted to avoid heat. We're trying to make space for both families, he said, as if families were furniture. I asked directly if he had planned to ask me to sign the deed away. He stumbled. We thought you might want to downsize, he said finally, the phrasing careful, as if he were trying on a suit that didn't fit. The truth tasted metallic. Behind him, for a breath, I heard a woman's laugh that was not my own, Priya. The phone clicked, words were smoothed away. With Mrs. Olson's recording and the lawyer's counsel, a pattern emerged. This was not spontaneity but plan. Priya had been weaving a practical story about better rooms and family closeness while arranging a subtle shift in ownership. I thought of my husband's watch in the drawer and the stack of library cards I had saved like talismans. If they thought I would simply leave because they asked, they had underestimated something older than anger, my memory of a life's worth of small decisions. I made a list, each item a quiet weapon: texts, dates, names. If they wished to claim I was forgetful, I would show them my ledger of days. Cliffhanger, that night, when I returned to the house under the pretense of picking something up, I found the master bedroom door slightly ajar. The master bedroom smelled of new perfume and lemon cleaner. A framed photo of my husband had been moved into a hall, less visible, as if grief should be tucked away. I stood by the doorway and counted the boxes, each labeled in Priya's tidy hand. I opened the filing cabinet that had my name on a brass plate and pulled out the yellowed deed. The paper was crisp as if it had been handled recently. It showed my name as owner in clean ink. I took a photo on my phone, practical proof, the way I had photographed repairs to lend proof to a claim. Mr. Keene explained, matter of fact, what the deed meant: you have full authority. Daniel has no legal claim unless you sign. I felt as if a window had been opened after a long, stale night. The knowledge that the law was on my side did not remove loneliness, but it steadied my hands. I began to catalog everything: emails, messages, the note from the real estate agent about market value. A curious, cold part of me calculated the numbers. The house could fetch more than I had imagined, enough to buy a smaller place that would not be crowded with memories turned sour. There was a strange liberation in arithmetic. Cliffhanger, that evening, a young woman knocked at my temporary door, a real estate agent with a thin folder and an apologetic smile. Her name was Hannah, and she had the easy competency of someone who had seen the dramas of houses before. We met at a tea shop instead of my rented room because discretion felt like an ally. She listened without surprise. There is a business rhythm to astonishment, and she said the market was favorable. You can move quickly if you wish, she said, and I felt the option uncoil inside me like a rope I could climb. I did not want to hurt Daniel. I wanted to be seen. But I also wanted boundaries. Signing the listing felt less like a hostile act and more like reclaiming a choice. We discussed viewings that could be arranged on days I chose, and she recommended a staging that honored my husband's taste while not feeling like a museum. For the first time since being told to pack, I felt an odd steadiness. There is a peculiar dignity in making a plan that your betrayer does not expect. I kept the listing quiet, only a handful of people knew. I made a ritual of putting my husband's favorite book back on the shelf and taking a photograph to remember its place. The small acts of preservation steadied me. Cliffhanger, days later, during a preview for a potential buyer, I saw Priya slip into the hallway and watched the strangers with a look like a viper considering a bird. When the first real buyers came through, Priya materialized as if summoned by a sense of proprietorship. She called me Mom, in a tone that tasted false, and asked the visitors if they had any questions about family history. It was a hostile hospitality, claiming stories to anchor her place. The agent, Hannah, handled it with trained calm and later told me, off the record, that Priya had tried to tell the buyers the house had always belonged to their family. Hannah's face was sympathetic when she said it. Sympathy is the currency of those who witness the small cruelties of close people. At dinner that night, Daniel's voice was tight. He accused me gently, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." It struck me how often people mistake boundary for battle. I had planned to sell to reclaim peace, not provoke war. Yet their resistance lit a stubbornness in me I hadn't expected. I began to keep a record of every confrontation, dates, times, who said what. Mrs. Olson even helped me write down the details when my hands shook. The house, which had once been a slow comfort, had become a stage where I would quietly prove I belonged there. Cliffhanger, the morning after, a plain white envelope arrived under the door, a note from someone who had been at the viewing. The envelope contained a short line, "I heard things, call me." The caller was a neighbor who had been at the viewing and who now confessed she'd overheard Priya telling a friend they were working on transferring things quietly. I began to assemble a dossier that felt like a ledger of my life and their deceit. I printed internet transcripts, saved voicemail, and annotated dates. My medical records, recent checkups showing my cognitive clarity, were scanned and placed in a folder. I collected bank statements showing payments I had made for taxes and repairs. There were messages where Daniel had suggested assisted living, in a way that had felt like concern but now read like a plot. For several nights I shut myself in and performed a quiet liturgy: label, scan, file. Each item I added felt like a brick laid for a bridge I would cross when needed. People ask how one prepares for betrayal. You make a careful inventory of truth. I spoke to Mr. Keene about a worst-case scenario, if Daniel or Priya tried to challenge the sale, and he recommended I prepare medical clearance and witnesses. The act of organizing soothed the panic. It turned fear into steps. My hands moved with the steady certainty of someone cataloging books. Cliffhanger, as I sealed the last folder, the solicitor's office called. Daniel had filed papers. The papers arrived like a winter storm, a legal filing asserting I was mentally unfit to manage my affairs. Someone had signed it, Daniel's name, but the hand had the clarity of someone coached. The paper claimed occasional forgetfulness was proof of incapacity. My chest tightened in a peculiar way, the same tightness I felt before readings at the library when the room held its breath. I went to Mr. Keene and he set out what we needed to respond: medical records, witness statements, the neighbor's audio, and the ledger of my payments. He told me, simply, "This is a tactic." The world narrowed to clear steps: gather, present, prove. On the day of the hearing, I sat in a small room with a table and a single lamp. Daniel entered with his face ashy. Priya's expression was a mask of righteous worry. They painted a picture of a woman who misplaced keys and forgot appointments. I listened to the narrative they tried to weave and felt each thread as an insult. I could have screamed at the unfairness of it, my son putting my mind on trial, but something steadier rose in me. I presented my documentation, answered questions with calm clarity, and watched the faces that had once been familiar shift in the light of facts. Cliffhanger, when the judge finished reading and set down the files, he said, quietly, "I see no evidence of incapacity." The judge's words were simple and clean. The filing was dismissed. Daniel's shoulders sagged like a man who had been expecting applause and found silence. Priya's face went a degree paler, the veneer of righteousness cracked. I did not gloat. Instead, I felt exhausted and strangely mournful for the son I had thought I knew. I had always imagined confrontation as an explosion. Instead it was paperwork, witnesses, and the steady testimony of neighbors and doctors who spoke for me. Mr. Keene patted my hand afterwards in that discreet way that makes sure you understand the job is done but not finished. Outside the courtroom, a young clerk, one of those people who watches too many dramas, told me she admired the way I had kept my composure. I thought of my husband's watch ticking in a drawer and of the way we had argued over small household matters when Daniel was a boy. There was no cathartic shouting, no public shaming, only the quiet enforcement of truth. Still, the rupture remained. Daniel's apology, when it came later in the parking lot, was thin and late. I thought, he started, then stopped. It was not yet the time for mending. Cliffhanger. 2 days after the hearing, Hannah called to say the house had an offer, and the buyers wanted to close quickly. I walked back into the house with the buyer at my side, a tidy woman with a respectful smile and a practical appreciation for old things. Priya was in the hallway, her mouth open as if she were watching a play she had not directed. Her parents sat at the kitchen table, stunned into silence. I felt a peculiar mixture of sorrow and relief as I traced the familiar grooves on the banister with a finger. Sales are, by nature, transactions. They are also goodbyes. The buyer, Mr. and Mrs. Patel, were gentle with the stories I told them about the garden and the way the light fell through the dining room window on winter afternoons. Daniel watched me and, for the first time since all this began, looked like a son who had lost something real. He tried to apologize, and I let the words fall where they needed. There was no triumphant speech. My victory was not about humbling anyone, it was about choosing what I needed. When I handed the keys over to the buyer, their fingers closed around metal that had lived in my pocket for 40 years. I felt the weight of letting go, and the surprising lightness after. Cliffhanger. On the threshold, Priya stepped forward with a small suitcase and said, "You can't possibly leave everything behind." The lakeside apartment was smaller and quieter than the house had been, but it had a window that caught the sun in the way my husband's study once did. I unpacked slowly, placing the books that mattered most in a neat row. There was a small, honest bookshelf club at a nearby community center. Mrs. Olson had arranged for me to meet them, and the first meeting was full of strangers who would soon become neighbors. The days were gentle, physiotherapy for my hip, walks by the water, afternoons reading aloud to children at the library's storytelling hour. The buyer sent photos of the house sometimes. They had planted lavender where my husband liked roses. It was not revenge so much as a rearrangement, my life, pared to essentials and given back to me. Daniel called less. The silence from him was a wound that did not always ache, sometimes it let clarity in. I learned small pleasures again, buttered toast at 8, a phone call that was only about the weather. I volunteered at the archive, helping to catalog old town records. In company, I felt myself stitch together the soft new seams of belonging. Cliffhanger. One evening, a message arrived on my phone. "Mum, can we talk?" "I'm sorry." It was Daniel. I read Daniel's message beside the lake as the sky went the color of old paper. My first impulse was to set the phone down and walk away. Instead, I sat on the bench until the sunset finished and then I typed a reply I wanted to keep for myself. Even if I never send it, I forgive myself for staying too long. I hope you find what you are looking for. Forgiveness, I have learned, is not a gift only given to others, it is a reclamation. In the months that followed, Daniel and I exchanged short, careful messages. He visited once, and we had tea like two people learning to be friends rather than the family we once were. The house, now lived in by the Patels, was kept with respect. They left my husband's old rocking chair in the sunroom because they loved how it creaked. I learned that dignity is not loud, it is the steady refusal to be small. My quiet victory was not in a spectacle but in having chosen myself, documented truth, and walked forward with my head lifted. If this story leaves you with anything, let it be this: age is not an erasure, and boundaries are acts of love, for yourself.